Hi there, welcome back. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. And if you're comfortable, share in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? I love reading those. It feels like we're all falling asleep together, even from far away. Tonight, we're going to travel far back in time, to the sun-drenched banks of the Nile River, where the land was fertile, the waters slow and gentle, and life followed the rhythm of the flooding seasons. Our story is simple and perhaps a little hungry, because tonight we're asking, what did people eat in ancient Egypt? But don't expect grand feasts in golden halls. We'll take it slowly. Wheat fields under a rising sun, jars of honey sealed with beeswax, clay ovens crackling softly in the afternoon shade. Ordinary people doing ordinary things, one meal at a time. So, if your day has been long, if your thoughts are busy or your mind needs quiet, settle in. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let's take a gentle walk through the kitchens, farms, and marketplaces of one of the world's oldest civilizations. Before pyramids, before scrolls of ink and gods in stone, there was wheat and barley and the slow hush of a morning wind over fertile soil. In ancient Egypt, the story of food begins not in the palace, but in the fields, the humble fields beside the Nile, where grain grew quietly, season after season, feeding a civilization. It is early morning. The sun has not yet risen high, and the ground is still soft with dew. A farmer walks slowly between rows of wheat, his feet sinking just slightly into the moist, black earth. This earth, the Kemet, they called it, the gift of the Nile, dark and fertile from the river's annual flooding. He bends and inspects the tall stalks of emmer wheat, brushing them gently with his fingers. Each one holds promise. The harvest is near. Next to the wheat stands barley, waving softly in the breeze. Pale green turning gold. A quiet transformation. The kind you can only see if you visit the same field every morning. The harvest begins in silence.
No machines.
Only hands, blades, and breath. Farmers use curved flint sickles, simple, beautiful tools that haven't changed for centuries. They stoop low, slicing at the base of the stalks, catching the falling bundles gently in their arms. Children follow, gathering stray grains. Birds circle overhead. The rhythm is steady. Snip, gather, tie. Snip, gather, tie. These bundles are laid out on mats of woven reed to dry. The sun does the rest. Slowly, silently, the outer husks crisp and loosen. When the grain is dry enough, it is brought to the threshing floor. A wide, open space beside the home. Here, oxen are guided in circles across the bundles, their hooves separating the grain from the chaff. Dust rises in soft clouds, lit golden by the mid-morning sun. Children laugh as they scatter the chaff into the air and watch it drift. Winnowing follows. Large shallow baskets are filled with the threshed grain and tossed into the breeze. The wind takes the light husk. The heavy grain falls back. Again and again, until only clean, golden kernels remain. These are poured into clay jars. Tall, narrow, sealed with mud and palm leaves. They are stored in cool, shaded rooms, protected from moisture, from insects, from time. In every Egyptian household, rich or poor, there is a grindstone. Two thick circular stones, worn smooth by generations of use. The quern. A woman kneels by the quern, She pours a handful of grain onto the lower stone. With both hands, she pushes and pulls the upper stone, grinding the kernels into coarse flour. It is hard work and slow, but her movements are steady and her expression is calm. This is her morning ritual. Dust floats through a shaft of morning light. A child sits nearby, tying small bundles of dried herbs. The only sound is stone against stone, and the soft breathing of the household just beginning to stir. The flour she produces is unrefined, slightly coarse, yellowish gray. It smells of earth and sun. This flour will become bread. And what bread it is! Bread was the centerpiece of every Egyptian meal. More than food, it was culture, currency, offering, and inheritance. The simplest kind is flatbread, water and flour, sometimes a pinch of salt. Mixed by hand in a clay bowl, the dough is patted into rounds and slapped onto a hot surface. A griddle, a flat stone, or the side of a clay oven. Cooks fast. Bubbles rise. Edges crisp. And then it's done. A warm, soft disc, slightly smoky. For variety, there are buns and rolls. Round little breads baked with bits of onion, leeks, or garlic. Sometimes they are sweetened with dates or fig paste. The dough is pressed into clay molds with floral patterns, leaves, or animals. These loaves are baked, cooled, and served with stews or cheese. Children are often given these small rolls with honey or thick date syrup as a treat. Leavened bread, the kind that rises, is rarer. It's made using yeast from beer sediment. Bakers leave the dough out overnight in a warm corner of the kitchen. By morning, it has risen, just a little, enough to make it soft, airy, and full of life. The ovens used are called taboons, round, clay structures with a hollow center open at the top. They are preheated with sticks, dried grass, or even dried animal dung. The inside glows orange. When the coals are ready, the baker sweeps them aside, pats the bread against the hot wall, and covers the top with a clay lid. Steam rises, and in minutes the dough is transformed. A gentle hiss escapes. The scent is everywhere. Earthy, bready, faintly sweet. It settles into the walls, the hair, the clothes. Even today, in parts of rural Egypt, this same bread is made in nearly the same way. Bread fed the farmers. It fed the workers who hauled stone for temples. It fed the children who chased goats along the riverbank. It fed the scribes who copied prayers onto papyrus, and the priests who recited them. It was also wages. A worker might be paid in loaves, 1 loaf per day of labor, 2 if the sun was high, 3 if he had a family, and bread was offering, placed in tombs with the dead, for nourishment in the afterlife, left in temples for gods, who, it was believed, consumed its essence, leaving the physical loaf behind. Bread connected the worlds, of the living and the divine. Imagine an Egyptian evening. The day is cooling. The sky is apricot and rose. A woman removes the final loaf from the oven. She sets it beside a dish of lentil stew and a jug of beer. Her husband enters, tired, dusty from the fields. He smiles, washes his hands, and joins her. The child reaches for a small bun. The mother gently taps his fingers and divides it in 2. They eat slowly.
No rush.
Bread is meant to be savored. In marketplaces, bread is sold by women with baskets balanced on their heads. They call out the types, plain, onion, sweet. A trader hands over a string of garlic and receives 3 buns. Another barters a dried fish. Coins are rare, bread is trade. To listen to bread is to listen to Egypt's quiet heartbeat. Each loaf a story, each bite a memory passed down. Even now, in the quiet hush of your room, you might imagine the scent, the heat of the oven, the curve of the crust in someone's hands 5,000 years ago. And just like that, you are no longer alone. You are walking alongside them. In the kitchens, the fields, the slow ovens of ancient Egypt. Festivals, before the sacred offerings and banquet tables, there were ordinary days. In ancient Egypt, life unfolded with rhythm, shaped by the rise and fall of the Nile, by sun and shadow, by hunger and harvest. And at the center of that rhythm was food, simple, sustaining, quietly sacred. Each morning, as the light slipped through reed-woven windows and the call of ibis birds echoed over the canals, the first stirrings of the kitchen began. Fires were rekindled using coals from the night before. A woman, wrapped in linen, bent over a clay oven, its domed belly warm from the embers inside. With practiced hands, she shaped dough from barley flour and water, flattening it into rounds. The dough hissed as it touched the stone, rising slowly into warm, dense loaves, the bread of life. Most households ate 2 meals a day, one in the morning, one in the evening. Breakfast was often modest, perhaps a piece of flatbread, a few dates, and a sip of beer. Not the sharp, bitter drink we know today, but thick, nourishing, and slightly sweet. Brewed from half-baked barley loaves soaked and fermented, it was as much food as drink. Children might be sent out to gather herbs or greens growing wild at the edge of the fields. Sorrel, mallow, purslane. These were tossed into pots to make stews or boiled down into pastes, eaten with bread. Lunch, if it happened, was informal. A bite shared in the shade, a fig pulled from a tree, a handful of roasted chickpeas. But the evening meal was different. It brought the family together. Fathers returned from the fields, mothers from the market, and children from errands run along the canals. The air cooled, and in the center of the courtyard or on the rooftops under open sky, people gathered to eat. Bowls were unwrapped, steam rising from lentils cooked with garlic and coriander. Roasted onions filled the air with sweetness. There might be boiled fish from the river, wrapped in leaves and set beside bowls of pickled vegetables. Everything eaten with the hands, with quiet chewing and low conversation. There was no furniture as we know it, no tables or chairs. People sat on mats woven from reeds, legs crossed, backs hunched gently, the sky turning slowly from gold to violet above them. The food was humble, but it was enough. Even the tools of cooking carried a soft kind of elegance. Clay pots, some blackened by fire, some polished smooth, lined the shelves. Mortars and pestles carved from limestone, used to grind spices. Cumin, coriander, fenugreek, and the sharp heat of garlic. Stone querns for milling grain, with the rhythmic scraping sound of women grinding flour each morning, like a slow heartbeat through the village. In wealthier homes, there were copper ladles and fine pottery. But in most households, the kitchen was a corner of the courtyard, shaded with palm fronds, cooled by breeze and patience, and always the scent of bread. Children were fed first. The youngest were spooned soft porridge made from emmer or barley, sometimes sweetened with dates or mixed with goat milk when available. Fingers were dipped into sauces, flatbread torn into little pieces. No one measured portions. They simply watched until the child's belly was full and their eyes began to drift. Adults followed slowly, in turns with no great ceremony. There was no pressure to eat quickly. Food was taken gently, shared easily, and always respected. Meat was a luxury for most, something to be saved for special days. But fish, plentiful and fresh from the Nile, appeared more often. Caught in woven nets or with sharpened reed spears, fish were dried in the sun, smoked or fried in clay ovens. Salted mullet, pickled perch, or grilled catfish wrapped in fig leaves. Each fish cleaned, prepared, and flavored with the herbs at hand: dill, mint, garlic, or just a dash of salt. Eggs from ducks or geese were sometimes included, boiled or mixed into stews. And in the cooler months, when the Nile's breath brought chill to the evenings, heavier dishes appeared. Thick lentil soups with crushed garlic, roasted radishes, and bowls of cracked wheat porridge flavored with onion. Food changed with the seasons, and the seasons were known by the tongue. Even snacks carried meaning. Roasted lotus seeds, crunchy and nutty. Dried figs and dates, pressed into sweet rolls. Cucumbers sliced thin and soaked in vinegar, eaten slowly under the sun. Simple, portable, and nourishing. Farmers often tucked a bundle of bread and onion into a cloth before setting out to the fields. They might stop beneath a sycamore tree at midday, wipe the sweat from their faces, and eat in silence while the world buzzed with bees and birds around them. It was not lonely. It was peaceful, a quiet break in the rhythm of the day. And at night, after the last dishes were washed in a basin of cool water, the fire allowed to burn low, and the stars returned to their watch, families might sit a while longer, just listening, perhaps nibbling the last crust of bread, or sipping warm beer from a shared cup, telling stories about the gods or dreams or memories of the last flood season. Children might fall asleep against their mother's side. A cat might curl in the ashes of the hearth. And somewhere, in a corner of the room, the smell of coriander still lingered. This was daily life, unhurried, gentle, sustained not only by what they ate but how they ate it, in gratitude, in rhythm, in peace. As we move deeper into the quiet routines of daily life, the beauty of ancient Egyptian food culture becomes more visible, not in extravagance, but in intimacy. Meals were not only a matter of survival, they were moments of presence. And for many, preparing food was a kind of ritual of love. In smaller homes, the kitchen was often just an open space near the doorway or in a rear courtyard, a patch of earth where the ground was slightly blackened from fire, where a few stones were arranged to support pots, and where the scent of yesterday's bread lingered on the air. There were no clocks,
No timers.
Instead, food followed the rhythm of breath and habit. A woman might begin her morning by soaking lentils in a clay basin, then kneel to grind barley with a circular motion, the sound of stone on stone blending with the cooing of doves in the roof thatch. Nearby, a child might be singing softly to a doll made of palm fronds while the pot begins to bubble. A goat sniffs around the fire pit, and a rooster pecks at crumbs along the edge of the step. There is no urgency, no rush, just the slow passing of time made visible through food. And while bread was the foundation of every meal, it was never quite the same. Some loaves were long and thin like walking sticks. Others were round, thick, and scored across the top with patterns made from fingertips. Festive loaves were sweetened with honey, shaped into animal forms, or dyed with saffron or crushed berries. Bread was sometimes baked with herbs like thyme or mint. At other times, seeds were pressed into the surface, flax, sesame, or fenugreek. Every family had their variation, their method, their rhythm. Mothers taught daughters how to feel when dough was just soft enough. Fathers passed on secrets about keeping coals alive through the night for the next morning's baking. Recipes weren't written. They were remembered in hands, in scent, in repetition. Some families grew what they ate. Behind their homes, small garden plots would be carefully maintained. These gardens, sometimes called kitchen gardens, were tended mostly by women, children, and the elderly, those whose days were centered around the home. There, they cultivated onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, radishes, and cucumbers. Fruits, too, if they were lucky. Dates, sycamore figs, grapes trained across wooden trellises. Pomegranates were highly prized, their deep red seeds glistening like tiny jewels. Watering was done with clay pots or through simple irrigation channels filled from the canal or well. It was slow work, done in the early morning or late evening, when the heat softened and the air turned still. Children often carried the harvest home in baskets woven from papyrus reeds, their feet dusty, their laughter soft as they passed through the shaded alleyways. And though food was sacred in many ways, it was also playful. Mothers shaped boiled lentil paste into small patties for children, sometimes in the shape of birds or flowers. Fathers toasted barley in small pans and popped it with honey to make sticky snacks that could be tucked into cloths for later. Figs were stuffed with nuts or pressed flat and dried into chewy, sweet bars. During hotter seasons, people would cool jars of beer or milk by submerging them in shaded basins of water, wrapping the vessels in damp cloth to keep them chilled. It was a quiet kind of inventiveness, simple tricks passed down through generations, solutions made not from wealth but from care. And so much of ancient Egyptian eating was communal. Very few people ate alone. Even workers laboring far from home, building canals or carving stone in royal tombs, gathered together in the evenings to eat as a group. The state provided rations: bread, dried fish, onions, and beer, but these were often supplemented with food traded between friends: a handful of dates, a roasted root, or even a piece of cheese salted and wrapped in cloth. There were no napkins or plates as we know them. Food was served in large shared bowls, and people ate with their fingers or small wooden spoons, dipping bread into sauces, licking their hands clean, smiling as the day softened into night. At the heart of every meal, no matter how simple, was connection. Between parents and children, between friends, between the living and the gods. It was not about abundance. It was about presence. To prepare food was to care. To serve food was to love. To eat together was to remember that life, in all its dust and hardship, still held sweetness. And sometimes the most meaningful meal was not even eaten. In the countryside, when a farmer's harvest was good, he might take a small basket of his best onions, a loaf of fresh bread, and a jug of date beer, and place them beneath a tree alone with no one watching. A quiet offering to the gods, to say, "I have enough." and I give thanks. No words spoken, just food, left beneath the branches of a tree older than memory. And when the wind blew through the reeds that afternoon, and the fields shimmered like gold beneath the sun, it felt, for just a moment, like the gods had answered. Even animals were not left out of mealtime. Cats, cherished in Egyptian households, were often fed scraps of fish or milk when available. Dogs gnawed on leftover bones, or shared bits of bread soaked in broth. And in the quiet moments after supper, when the bowls had been licked clean and the air was thick with dusk, you could often find a sleeping child with one hand resting on the warm belly of a purring cat beside the hearth. This was daily food in ancient Egypt, not a grand feast, but a quiet thread, tying together the rhythms of living, loving, giving, and remembering. It was not written in stone. It was not painted in tombs, but it lived in the hearts and hands of ordinary people, every day, for thousands of years. And when we slow down enough and breathe in the scent of warm bread, when we sit in silence and share what we have, we join them, across time, across the Nile. But not all sacred meals happened under the open sky. Within the hush of temples, cool, incense-filled sanctuaries, the rituals of divine feasting unfolded with solemn grace. Each morning, before the city stirred, priests would bathe and dress in fresh white linen. They entered the inner sanctum with care, their movements slow, almost reverent. Before the statue of a god Ammonius, Hathor, Osiris, or Batet, they laid trays of offerings. These were not meager gifts. Golden plates held loaves shaped like animals and crowns, clay jars brimmed with date beer and sweet wine, bowls overflowed with grapes, melons, figs, and finely cut herbs. No one ate these offerings, not in the way we understand eating. The gods, they believed, consumed the essence, the ka of the food, the spirit, its breath. And when the offering was complete, the food was removed and distributed among the temple staff. A sacred meal now blessed and shared. Even in death, food remained vital. Inside tombs of nobles and kings, entire feasts were carved into stone walls. Scenes of servants preparing banquets, grinding flour, stirring pots, carving meats. Models were left too, tiny clay bakers kneading dough, toy-like granaries filled with real grains, miniature livestock sculpted and painted with delicate care, all meant to feed the soul in the afterlife. And the menus? They were elaborate. For the wealthy, grilled duck, roasted quail, beef cooked with onions, stews flavored with coriander and fenugreek. There were honey cakes, fruit compotes, and jugs of wine scented with lotus petals. It was not indulgence. It was preparation for eternity. But even among the poor, there was care in what was left behind. A flat loaf, a dried fig, a message, I fed you in life, and I will not let you go hungry in death. Some festivals celebrated harvest, others honored gods, but there were also celebrations of the self. Birthdays, for instance, though rare, were marked with special meals. Perhaps not grand, but filled with intention. A woman might prepare lentils with garlic and herbs, lay a cloth on the ground beneath a fig tree, place beside her a jug of beer and a small cake soaked in honey, and spend the evening with her family, listening to wind, sharing stories. The meal itself became the celebration. At weddings, bread was shaped into symbolic forms. Hands clasping, fish for abundance, ears of wheat. Dates were mashed into a paste, rolled with sesame and almonds, and served with fermented milk or wine. Families exchanged baskets filled with preserved fruits, goat cheese wrapped in palm leaves, and fresh loaves wrapped in linen. These meals were memories in the making, and in the quieter corners of Egypt, in desert hamlets and reed villages, even the humblest meal became sacred when shared. At night, after a festival had ended, and the village returned to its regular stillness, the fire pits glowed with the last coals. Stray dogs nosed at the ashes, and the scent of spices still lingered in the cool air: cardamom, cinnamon, toasted grain. A child might wake in the middle of the night, walk barefoot across the cold floor to the hearth, and find a leftover fig or piece of flatbread tucked in a cloth, a small comfort, like a whisper of the feast just past. And just like that, we understand something deeper about ancient Egypt. Not just what they ate, but why they ate the way they did. To nourish, to remember, to connect, to give thanks. Food was ritual. It was medicine. It was a form of love passed silently from hand to hand, mouth to mouth, generation to generation. It was never rushed, never wasted, always part of something larger. Even today, if you walk along the banks of the Nile at dusk, you might see a small family seated under a fig tree, passing a loaf of bread between them, drinking from the same jug, laughing softly, their voices blending with the rustle of palm fronds and the lapping of the river. And in that moment, 5,000 years dissolves. Time folds in on itself, and you are right there, among them, and the warmth of the feast lingered. The following morning, the village would be quiet again. Ash from the night's fires still smoldered in shallow pits, and garlands of withered flowers swayed gently on doorways. Children padded sleepily through the dusty alleys, nibbling the last of the honey buns, and elders returned to their porches, nodding to each other in quiet understanding. The festival had come and gone, yet its glow stayed behind, like perfume on the air. It wasn't only the big, calendar-marked days that drew people together for sacred meals. Even in the small, unspoken rituals of life, Egyptians infused food with meaning. At the birth of a child, neighbors brought gifts not of gold or gems, but of nourishment. A jar of cow's milk, a roll of soft bread, a handful of dried dates tied in palm fiber. And as the baby nursed quietly in the shade of a mud-brick wall, its mother might take tiny bites between feeding soft, sustaining food shared in silence with the new life she held. In sickness too, food took on a sacred shape. A healer might prepare a warm mash of lentils and cumin, believed to ease stomach pains, or boil a mixture of fenugreek and crushed garlic, its pungent steam filling the home, thought to chase illness from both body and spirit. Meals were medicine, gifts, symbols. Even the act of chewing together, families breaking bread from the same loaf, or drinking beer from a shared bowl, was a sign of unity. No formal ceremony was needed. The meal was the ritual. In wealthier homes, feasting took on more elaborate forms. Banquets for visiting officials or wedding celebrations would be planned weeks in advance. Long, low tables were covered with linens embroidered in ochre and blue. Guests reclined on cushions, leaning on one arm while servants moved gracefully between them, offering trays of meat, fruit, and wine. A typical banquet might begin with something light, perhaps a chilled cucumber soup, served in polished alabaster. Then followed a series of roasted meats, goose, quail, and spiced lamb. Sauces were flavored with coriander, honey, vinegar, and pomegranate molasses. Between courses, perfumed water was poured over guests' hands. Lotus blossoms floated in shallow bowls. Musicians played soft melodies with harps and reed flutes while dancers, barefoot and adorned in gold bangles, moved slowly among the guests. And all the while people ate, slowly, with intention, with praise for the host and for the gods who made abundance possible. But food was not only about joy. It also became a comfort during grief. When someone passed, relatives and friends gathered in the days that followed to eat together. Not to celebrate, but to hold each other in quiet support. The meals were simple: lentil porridge, flatbread, dried figs, served with silence and memories. One loaf might be placed on the tomb, still warm, a final gift, a promise that the departed would not be forgotten. Tombs themselves were filled with inscriptions detailing meals that the deceased wished to receive eternally. May 1,000 loaves, 1,000 jars of beer, and 1,000 geese be offered to me in the field of reeds. One typical inscription reads, "Even in eternity, food remained a thread tying spirit to earth." In quieter regions, away from cities and courts, the sacred meal continued in humbler ways. At dusk, a shepherd's family might gather beneath an olive tree. A simple dinner, dried fish rehydrated in vinegar, onions roasted in ash, warm bread would be shared. The sun would bleed across the desert horizon as they sat together, chewing slowly, listening to the bleating of distant goats. A child might ask, "Why do we eat this every new moon?" And a mother would answer softly, "So the gods remember us, so we don't forget who we are." Even in prisons or among the poor, Egyptians honored meals with quiet dignity. A thief awaiting judgment might still receive bread and beer before facing the scribes. And it was believed that kindness shown through food could carry favor in the afterlife. A single pomegranate offered to a hungry stranger was worth more in the divine scales than a pyramid raised from stone. So when we ask, what did ancient Egyptians eat? We're not just uncovering recipes. We're uncovering values, generosity, gratitude, spiritual connection, seasonal awareness, and the understanding that food could be sacred without being grand. A fresh fig plucked in summer, a handful of barley roasted on a stone, a sip of sweet beer beside a warm fire. These were as holy as the grandest feast in the halls of kings. And now, as your eyes grow heavier and your breath deepens, imagine one final scene. A lantern flickers inside a small stone home. A woman, aged but strong, stirs lentils in a clay pot. She adds a dash of salt and a few dried herbs from a pouch she's kept for decades. Behind her, her grandson watches quietly. He holds a piece of flatbread in his small hand, slightly warm from the oven. The fire crackles. The room smells of cumin, garlic, and old wood. She breaks the bread in half and passes him a bowl. And just before they eat, she whispers a blessing, not aloud, not in grand words, but in her breath, in the sharing, and together they eat, one bite at a time, in peace, in presence. If the kitchen was the heart of the home in ancient Egypt, then the market was the pulse of the village. Each morning, before the sun cast its full gaze over the clay rooftops and temple walls, the village began to stir, not with noise, but with quiet momentum. Down along the riverbanks, small boats rocked gently in the current, laden with baskets, clay pots, and bundles tied in woven cloth. Merchants stepped ashore, their feet bare, their robes loose, their hands calloused from work. Some came alone. Others came in pairs, guiding donkeys whose hooves tapped rhythmically against the cobbled alleys. Every traveler carried something to sell, something to trade, something grown, fished, or prepared by hand. And slowly, as if pulled together by unseen threads, the marketplace began to breathe. There was no grand architecture.
No sweeping plaza.
The market was simply space, an open stretch near the water, a shaded corner between homes, or a dirt path worn smooth by generations of feet. There, mats were unfurled, baskets arranged, pots opened. Colors bloomed against the sand. Green herbs, golden grains, dark figs, violet onions, red clay jars, and pale strips of dried fish. The voices of traders were not loud. They were familiar, even gentle. A woman knelt behind a tray of lentils, arranging them into neat piles with her fingers. A fisherman unwrapped leaves from a still glimmering catch. Two children darted between baskets, laughing softly, scattering birds that had landed to steal scraps. The market was alive, not in chaos, but in harmony. ####, the flow of trade. Food in ancient Egypt didn't stay where it was grown. The Nile, ever moving, became not just a source of life, but a highway for it. Goods moved up and down its banks on wooden boats, guided by oars, wind, and patience. From the delta in the north, traders brought garlic, papyrus, wine, and fish. From the south, they returned with lentils, cattle, and dates, sometimes exotic goods like incense and ivory from further beyond the borders. Farmers often came to town once or twice a week, their donkeys loaded with garlic bulbs, clay jugs of milk, or bulging sacks of grain. But trade wasn't just local. It extended far beyond the horizon of the familiar. Spices arrived from the Levant, olive oil from Canaan, incense from Punt, that mysterious southern land beyond the Red Sea, spoken of in whispers. And all of it passed through the hands of everyday merchants, men and women whose names were never etched into stone, but whose footsteps marked every corner of the village. ####, the sound and shape of Market Day. Market days unfolded slowly. A sunshade made of old linen fluttered in the breeze. A donkey brayed softly as it was tied to a tree. Somewhere, a boy sang to himself while weighing lentils in a clay bowl. There were no coin purses, no clinking of silver. Most people traded in barter, food for food, cloth for beer, oil for bread. A woman might approach a vendor with a jar of honey and leave with 2 smoked fish. Another might trade onions for a thread of linen to mend her child's tunic. Even scent became currency. A seller of herbs would crush mint between her fingers and hold it up. No words spoken, just the smell, the memory, the need. ####, characters of the market. There were personalities, the quiet rhythm makers of the street. The bread seller with a crooked back and a voice like warm dust, who remembered everyone's names and always gave the softest loaf to the children. The fig vendor who arranged her fruits in perfect spirals and hummed old songs under her breath. She never raised her price, not once in all her years. And the spice merchant, his stall a cloud of scent, his fingers stained with saffron and cinnamon. He wore beads around his wrists and never hurried anyone. Even beggars had a place. They sat at the edges, sometimes offered crusts of bread or a ladle of lentils from a kind vendor's pot. There was no wealth as we think of it, but there was abundance, an abundance of care, of time, of small rituals repeated in every transaction. ####, food as culture, not commodity. The market was never only about commerce. It was about exchange, of food, yes, but also of stories. A vendor from upriver might speak of rising floodwaters. A buyer might share news of a relative returning from labor in a royal project. Children carried messages between stalls, news, jokes, gossip, and memories. Recipes were shared like treasures. Boil the lentils 3 times, not 2. Roast the onions before adding the cumin. Pick figs while they're still firm. The soft ones go bad by midday. These were not secrets. They were gifts. Knowledge passed through generations, not on paper, but through hands and mouths and smiles. And sometimes, a vendor would slip an extra handful of dates into a child's basket without a word, just because. Closing the day. As the day stretched, the shadows lengthened and crept toward the stalls. The buzz of the market softened to a hum. Some vendors packed slowly, tying up bundles and cloth, lifting empty baskets onto their heads. Others lingered, enjoying the last light. A few sat cross-legged, sharing whatever hadn't been sold. Bread dipped in oil, salted cucumbers, dried figs. The donkeys were untied. The children, sleepy, clung to their mothers' robes. The river shimmered gold. And as the market emptied, it left behind not just footprints in the dust, but the gentle echo of lives intertwined. A song still floating in the air. A scent of lentils and fire. The sense that something sacred had passed between neighbors, not bought, not sold, but shared. Beyond the town, remote markets and village trade. In more rural regions, markets were less frequent. A small clearing near a temple. A crossroads between fields. Sometimes, traveling merchants would arrive only once every few weeks, carrying goods from larger towns, news from distant cities, rare treats like honeycomb or dyed cloth. Villagers would gather early, dressed in their finest tunics, baskets on their arms, coins carefully wrapped in cloth. There was excitement in the air, and also a quiet reverence. These gatherings were part festival, part lifeline. Children watched wide-eyed as spices were measured and weighed. Elders exchanged memories of markets past. Young couples shared bread beneath sycamore trees. And when the traders left, the village carried on. Stocked with goods, yes, but also with stories, laughter, and lightness. Food on the move, couriers and caravans. Some food had farther to travel. For elite households and temples, caravans were sent to retrieve delicacies. Beef from well-fed cattle. Rare fruits from oases. Spices from across the sea. Couriers on foot or donkeyback carried jars wrapped in linen and sealed with wax. Every amphora marked. Every item tracked. And yet, the delivery was never rushed. Time moved differently. People knew that food carried over great distances arrived changed, infused with the scent of sand, river, wind, and sun. And when it reached its final table, it brought with it not just nourishment, but the world beyond. Markets in memory. For many Egyptians, the memory of market days lingered long after childhood. A certain smell of garlic frying in oil or barley roasting in clay could take them back, to the shade of a linen tent, to the coolness of early morning, to the voice of a grandmother haggling for onions. And for those who had left the villages to work on royal projects or serve in distant temples, these memories were anchors. They would speak of the bread seller with the crooked back, the cat that slept beside the fig baskets, the old woman who always wore 2 scarves, even in summer. Memories not of gold or glory, but of food, shared. Conclusion, the sacred simplicity of exchange. In the stillness of evening, after the last buyer had gone home and the stalls stood empty, you could almost hear the market rest, as if it, too, had lungs and needed sleep. The quiet settled like dust, gently, lovingly. The last breadcrumb was picked up by a sparrow. The last laugh echoed off the clay walls and faded. And the villagers returned home, hands full, bellies warm, their hearts settled by the rhythm of something far older than time, the rhythm of giving and of receiving, of feeding and being fed, a rhythm that echoed the Nile itself, always flowing, always returning. In ancient Egypt, food did not end at the table. It crossed the veil, into temples, into tombs, into the quiet corridors of eternity. While daily meals were simple and shared, ritual food was something else entirely. It was sacred, symbolic. It was communication with the divine. As the sun dipped low over the golden fields, and the Nile's waters whispered against the reeds, people gathered not just to eat, but to honor the gods, to mark the passage of seasons, to send their love beyond the living world. ####### dove offerings to the divine. In temples, priests awoke before the village. Long before birds stirred in their nests, the temple courtyards were already washed clean, the altars dusted, the sacred fires rekindled. Their food was not for the body but for the gods. Offerings were prepared with deep care. Fresh bread was baked, sometimes shaped in the form of animals or sacred symbols. Jars of beer were poured carefully, the foam skimmed off with reeds. Fruits, grapes, figs, pomegranates, were polished and arranged in wide shallow bowls. Even the placement of food mattered. It had to face the right direction. It had to be fresh. And once offered, it was not discarded. Instead, it was shared among temple workers, believed to have been blessed by the gods' unseen presence. In this way, divine nourishment flowed back to the people. ##### sheaf of rice festivals and feasting. Throughout the year, entire villages paused for festivals. Some marked the flood. Others honored Isis, Osiris, or Horus. And others were for simpler things like the turning of the season or the reappearance of certain stars. During these days, food was abundant, even in modest homes. Honeyed bread was shaped like birds in flight. Beer was brewed stronger than usual, darker, sweeter, more fragrant. Stews were made from lentils and herbs, simmered with care, stirred slowly by women with gold bangles clinking at their wrists. The festival table was laid with intention. Even those with little gave something: a melon, a jar of milk, a bowl of roasted beans. Children wore garlands of flowers. Men played flutes, and fires crackled as meats. Sometimes duck, goose, or fish were grilled over coals under the stars. Feasting, for the Egyptians, was never simply about eating. It was about being alive together under the gaze of gods who had walked the earth before them. ##### Hindu temple, the temple kitchens. Behind every temple wall, beyond the carvings and incense, were kitchens, functional, busy, and filled with sound. Large clay ovens, grinding stones, reed baskets of onions, garlic, barley, and herbs. These were manned by temple servants and cooks, not nobles or scribes, but skilled hands who understood the rituals. Every item had to be prepared purely. Water used for washing came from sacred pools. Knives were washed before and after every cut. Nothing spoiled could be allowed. Nothing rushed. Even in a land of dust and heat, where preservation was a challenge, care was constant. In these kitchens, you could find recipes passed down by priests for centuries. And while the food was offered up to gods, it was also part of a larger system, feeding priests, workers, pilgrims, and the poor. Temples were not just spiritual hubs, they were social ones. And food was the warm thread that connected all levels of the sacred. ##### crescent moon food and funerals. But of all the sacred uses of food, none was more deeply felt than its place in death. To bury a loved one was not just to say goodbye. It was to prepare them for the journey. And no journey could begin on an empty stomach. Tomb paintings show long tables piled with food, baskets of onions and garlic, loaves of bread stacked like bricks, bowls of lentils, fish, fruit, and jars of beer. These weren't just decoration. They were instructions, a prayer made visible. We send you with everything you need. Eat, rest, walk in light, and return to us when the stars allow. Actual food was placed in tombs, dried, salted, or sealed in clay. Some even included dried meats wrapped in linen, or small cakes tucked inside painted jars. And where real food wasn't possible, models were used. Tiny loaves made of plaster, painted to look freshly baked. Miniature animals prepared as if for cooking. Little jars made to look full of milk or wine. To the ancient Egyptians, the boundary between symbol and reality was thin. Representation was enough if offered with faith. Hashtag, 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 hashtag I the eternal banquet. For the elite, the dream of the afterlife included a never-ending feast. Texts found inside tombs often included spells or charms that would allow the dead to summon food whenever needed. One spell reads, asterisk, may a loaf rise at your command. May beer pour without end. May geese lay before you roasted and fat, and figs burst sweetly in your mouth. Asterisk. This was not fantasy. This was comfort, a way to ease the fear of the unknown. To say, you will not hunger, you will not thirst, you are remembered, you are fed. Hashtag, 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 hashtag feeding the spirit. Even long after burial, families returned to the tombs, bringing food and wine, speaking to the stone walls as if their loved ones still sat within. Bread was placed carefully on stone slabs. Beer was poured into cracks in the floor. Figs were pressed into hand-shaped offerings. Some whispered stories. Others sang. Some simply sat in silence, the wind blowing gently through the tomb entrance, scattering petals and dust. In this way, the dead were never left behind. They were fed, and through food, they remained part of the living world. Hashtag, 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 hashtag fire the quiet symbolism of everyday food. Even the most ordinary meals held echoes of the sacred. When a mother gave her child a warm piece of bread, she was enacting a ritual as old as the pyramids. When a laborer drank beer at sunset, he shared a gesture with gods. There was no separation between sacred and simple. All food was life, and life was a sacred thing. Hashtag, 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 hashtag books conclusion, a feast beyond time. As we close this chapter, let us return once more to the cool silence of a tomb. A flicker of light from an oil lamp, the scent of preserved herbs, paintings on stone walls, showing baskets overflowing, loaves stacked, fruit glistening in bowls. In that place, a soul rests, not forgotten, not alone. Because someone once packed a meal for their journey. Because someone once said, you will not go hungry. Food in ancient Egypt was never just sustenance. It was memory. It was offering. It was hope. And in the soft glow of eternity, beneath the slow drifting stars, one can still imagine a table set, a loaf rising, a bowl waiting, and someone smiling just beginning to eat. Nile slowly stretching out like liquid silver beneath a purple sky. The day's final meal brought everyone together. There were no clocks in ancient Egypt, No evening news or glowing screens, just the rhythm of the earth, the hum of frogs, the scent of warm herbs drifting from clay pots. A mother stirred lentils into a bubbling stew while children chased shadows between flickering lanterns. A father unwrapped bread from palm fronds, smiling as the steam escaped. Around low tables or simply seated on the ground, families shared roasted fish, dried figs, and leftover onions from the market, simple, grounding food that had fed their ancestors for centuries. And in this final hour before rest, the village slowed to a whisper. The laughter softened. Even the wind through the reeds seemed quieter. Bellies full, heads nodding, the people of ancient Egypt curled beneath woven blankets, listening to the distant rustle of the Nile, the faint chirp of crickets. The stars overhead blinked lazily, and somewhere in the distance, a reed flute played a lullaby for no one in particular. And so, dear listener, drift gently now. Good night.